What if the man who preached against sin was the same one who years later whispered my name in the darkness of my bed? Hard to believe, isn't it? But this story is real, and it began in the place I least expected, inside a church. There, before the altar, with the scent of incense still in the air and the choir singing softly, he looked me in the eyes and shouted for all to hear, "God does not accept men like you." That day, I didn't just lose my faith. I lost my footing, my breath, and my will to live. But fate, the same fate that seems to play tricks on us, waited patiently to bring him back into my life. And when he did, it was in the cruelest and most beautiful way at the same time. Because the man who once expelled me from God's house ended up seeking shelter in mine. And what happened after that, it's the kind of thing nobody would dare preach on Sunday. This is not a story about church. It's a story about two men. One who spent his life trying to be a saint, and another who just wanted to be accepted. About guilt, desire, faith, and the kind of love you try to bury, but it always comes back. It always comes back. Even when the whole world says you shouldn't. Back then, I believed that loving a man was the same as carrying a sin in my heart, and he, the pastor, believed he was saving souls while destroying his own. But time is the greatest preacher there is, and he taught us both that there is no sermon more powerful than repentance, nor a prayer more sincere than a whispered plea for forgiveness in the early morning hours. So before I tell you what happened that night when he came back, I ask you, what would you do if the man who hurt you the most was the same man who, years later, asked you to stay? Before continuing this story, I want to ask you something important. If you've made it this far, it's because something in this story captivated you, perhaps the words, perhaps the silence between them. So, leave your like. Now this shows YouTube that this type of content still matters and helps this story reach more people who, like me, have felt trapped between faith and what their heart truly desires. And if you understand every emotion in this narrative, if you've ever felt the weight of judgment, the fear of loving, or the desire to be accepted, write in the comments, "I understand." It's a simple but powerful word. It creates a bridge between the one who feels and the one who hears, and makes this story continue to live far beyond the screen. Oh, and if you're not already subscribed, subscribe to the channel now. Here, each story is a mirror. Some show who we were, others reveal who we still have the courage to be. Click on sign up, turn on notifications, and follow the next chapter, because what comes next will make you see love, forgiveness, and faith in a way that no one has ever shown you before. When that night arrived, I no longer expected anything from life, much less from him. Enough time had passed to transform hatred into silence and silence into oblivion, or at least that's what I thought. I had lived alone for years, surrounded by a routine that seemed more like a refuge. I woke up early, made coffee, read the same pages as always, and tried not to think about what was left behind. The church, the altar, his words, everything seemed part of another life. But the past has a cruel gift. It never dies. It only waits for the right moment to reappear. And that night, he reappeared. 3 light knocks on the door. That's how it all began again. At first I thought it was a mistake. No one was looking for me at that hour, but something made me get up. Maybe curiosity, maybe an old instinct, or maybe a kind of premonition that only appears when fate is about to turn again. When I opened the door, the world stopped. It was him, the same man, the same look, but something about him was different. The suit that had once been impeccable was now wrinkled. His face was tired, and his eyes held a kind of pain I knew well. For a second I thought it was a hallucination, a belated punishment, a memory made flesh. But he took a deep breath, and the sound of his voice brought me back. "May I come in?" I stood there, speechless. The air felt trapped between my throat and chest. It was impossible to look at that man without feeling the weight of everything he represented. The humiliation, the judgment, the fear. It was all there, compressed into those seconds. But time changes the way we feel. The anger that once consumed me now seemed old. All I could say was, "Come in." He took 2 steps, and the sound of his shoes echoing on the cold floor brought a flood of memories to mind. I remembered the altar, the microphone crackling, the murmuring voices behind me. I remembered the tears I swallowed so as not to appear weak. I remembered the shame, but above all, I remembered his gaze, that same gaze that now, years later, seemed to ask for Forgiveness without needing to say a word. He sat on the sofa in silence. His hands trembled, and he stared at the floor as if he didn't know where to begin. I stood there, leaning against the wall, watching. Part of me wanted to hear what he had to say. The other part wanted him to leave, until he finally spoke. I came here because I can no longer live with the weight of what I've done. His voice was the same as before, but now without the authority of a pastor. He was just a broken man. He took a deep breath, and the words came out low, almost choked. I preached about love every Sunday, but I never knew what it was. I spoke of forgiveness, and I was incapable of forgiving myself. I shouted that God didn't accept men like you, because I was one of them. That sentence hit me like a confession and a punch at the same time. The air seemed to disappear from the room. I looked at him, trying to understand if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. But he continued, I felt the same way you did, and every time I saw you there kneeling, I hated myself for it. The anger I unleashed on you was the fear I had of myself. I sat down slowly, unable to utter a single word. The man who once destroyed my faith was now shedding the pride that made him feel untouchable, and seeing him there vulnerable, trembling with tears in his eyes, it was strange, because a part of me had waited for that moment my whole life. The apology, the acknowledgement, the truth. But when he finally came, I realized that forgiveness is harder than anger. Forgiving is like reopening a wound to see if it still hurts. I didn't come here to ask you to accept me, he said. I just wanted to look you in the eyes and tell you that I'm sorry. And if I ever said that God doesn't accept men like us, I want to believe that he will still forgive me for lying. The words hung in the air. I felt like screaming, like asking why now? Why after so much time? Why after so much damage? But all I could do was take a deep breath and say, you destroyed my faith. He looked at me and calmly replied, and you ended up saving mine. That sentence completely destroyed me. It was as if the weight of years of anger fell upon me and at the same time began to dissolve. The silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was a peaceful silence, the kind you don't understand, but feel. I didn't know what to say, and neither did he. He just stood there, staring blankly, until I stood up and said, would you like a coffee? He nodded, and that simple gesture, the invitation, the coffee, the shared silence, was the beginning of something I didn't yet know how to name. While the water boiled, I thought about everything that life had done to us. Two men marked by the same fear, trying to find each other after years of hiding behind a faith that never knew how to love. It was as if time had orchestrated that encounter to show that punishment doesn't always come to punish. Sometimes it comes to teach. He drank his coffee in silence, looked around and said, this house is peaceful, I replied. Some days it's like that. He smiled, and in that smile lay the beginning of a new chapter, one that I never imagined I was about to live. And if you've ever been through something that seemed impossible to forgive, comment below. I know what it's like to carry that. Because what happened after that night changed everything I believed about forgiveness, faith, and love. After that night, he started showing up more often. At first he said it was just a talk, to ease the weight he carried in his chest. But little by little I realized it wasn't just regret that brought him back. It was something deeper, more human, more dangerous. There was a kind of silence between us that hadn't existed before. Not the silence of judgment, but the silence of someone who recognizes themselves in the other. The first time he came back, he carried a Bible under his arm. I thought he was still trying to hide behind the words that protected him from what he truly felt. He placed the book on the table but didn't open it. He stared at the cover for a while and then said, I've spent my life reading this and forgetting the most important part, love. He smiled, a shy smile, almost as if apologizing for feeling too much. I offered him coffee, just like the other time. He accepted. While the water boiled, we talked about everything that had been left behind, life, time, loneliness. I realized that the man in front of me was no longer the pastor who had shouted at me from the altar. He was someone stripped of his own authority, trying to rebuild himself with what little he had left. He said he had lived alone for years, that after leaving the church no one contacted him again. He said he started attending smaller services, always as a visitor, but he never managed to preach again. I would go up to the pulpit and the words would freeze, he said, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I didn't have the courage to lie again. That confession hit me hard. For the first time I realized how much fear destroys not only the one who is condemned, but also the one who condemns. He wasn't a monster. He was a man who spent his life fighting against what he was, until there was nothing left to fight against. We talked for hours. Sometimes he would speak, sometimes he would just observe, as if he wanted to memorize the silence of the house. I let him. There was something about that interaction that made me feel good, even though I tried to deny it. It was as if the forgiveness he sought was, little by little, healing something in me as well. One afternoon, he arrived later than usual, carrying a small package. He said he had something to give me. When he opened it, it was a notebook. The pages were filled with notes, crossed-out verses, underlined phrases. "These are the sermons I never preached," he said. "The ones that spoke of love without condemnation. The ones I was afraid to read aloud." I picked up the notebook and slowly leafed through it. There were words about faith, forgiveness, courage, but what struck me most was a simple phrase, written in the middle of the page. "There is no sin in truly loving someone." I stared at it as if it were the first time I'd read something so pure in years. He watched me silently, and I noticed his hands were trembling. "I wrote this thinking of you," he said. "Back then, I didn't have the courage to speak. Today, I just want you to know." For a moment, I couldn't say anything. The air felt too heavy. I closed the notebook and looked at him. There were so many things I wanted to say, about the past, about the fear, about how much it all still hurt. But all that came out was, "You took too long to understand." He lowered his head and replied, "I know, and maybe it's too late." We fell silent. The rain began to fall outside, and its sound filled the space between us. He looked out the window and said, "You know what I fear most? Dying without having truly loved." I took a deep breath and replied, "Then stop fearing." He looked at me, surprised. "What do you mean?" I said without looking away. "You've spent your life running from love. Maybe it's time to stop running." It was the first time I saw tears in his eyes without shame. He didn't try to hide them. He just let them flow, silently. And in that moment I realized that something was changing. It wasn't just forgiveness. It was surrender. In the following weeks he kept coming back. Sometimes he brought wildflowers, other times only silence. And with each meeting, the weight of the past seemed lighter. I realized how much he was trying to be a better person, to understand what he had previously judged. He still carried guilt, but now he was learning to transform it into gestures, into care. One night, we were sitting at a table. The light was dim, the coffee was getting cold, and time seemed suspended. He held my hand without saying anything. It was a simple touch, but full of meaning. The same man who once pointed his finger at me now trembled as he touched me, as if that gesture were a silent plea for forgiveness. I looked at him and said, "You know what this means, right?" He smiled with that tired look and replied, "It means I'm tired of being afraid." At that moment, the entire past mingled within me. The hatred, the shame, the desire, the lost faith, everything merged into one thing, truth. And perhaps that's what was always missing between us. True. His touch turned into a hug, a long, dense hug, full of silence. And within that silence, I realized there was nothing left to prove, no sin to hide, no guilt to carry. Just two men trying to understand what the world has always said is wrong, and discovering for the first time that it wasn't. He whispered close to my ear, "I don't know where this is going, but I want to try." I closed my eyes and replied, "Then try it." That was the first night the past finally rested. No sermon, no Bible, no guilt, just the sound of the rain outside, the smell of coffee still in the air, and my heart beating at a rhythm I no longer remembered. And if you've made it this far, listening to me, maybe you know what I'm talking about. Maybe you've also experienced something that made you question what is right or wrong. Then write it down below. I've felt that way too. Because when you speak, when you share, the silence stops hurting. And what happened after that night? That's what really changed everything. The days that followed that night were unlike anything I had ever experienced. The house seemed different, as if the air had become lighter, as if the silence was no longer an absence, but a rest. I would wake up and see him there, sitting on the porch, drinking coffee and staring into nothingness, as if trying to decipher his own destiny. Sometimes he would look at me, and I would see in his eyes something that mixed peace and fear, as if he still couldn't believe that he could finally exist without having to apologize for it. Our relationship began naturally, without promises. He would come, stay, and then start sleeping over. At first, he would lie on the sofa. He said it was just for one night, out of politeness and respect. But as the days went by, the sofa became a habit, and the habit became a necessity. And I knew, neither of us wanted to admit it, but that space he occupied in the living room was already. The most curious thing is that over time, I realized he was still talking to God, but in a different way. He didn't preach, he didn't ask, he didn't quote verses, he just conversed. One day I heard him in a low voice in the kitchen saying, "If the Lord hears me now, understand what I feel is not sin, it's life." That gave me goosebumps, because for so long I myself had asked God to take away what I felt, and now to hear him, the man who expelled me, saying the opposite, was like seeing my own faith reborn before my eyes. During the mornings we hardly spoke. It was a good silence, the kind where people understand each other without needing to explain. Sometimes I would wake up and see him tending the garden. Other times I would find him washing dishes, distracted as if trying to rebuild a routine within what the world would call wrong, and that was the beauty of it. Two older men, marked by different kinds of guilt, learning to exist without shame. But, like everything born, from pain, the love that was beginning to grow there was fragile. A single memory, a comment, a piece of news was enough to make everything tremble. One afternoon, while we were having coffee, he said something that surprised me. "People recognized me on the street," he said, with a tone that mixed shock and resignation. "Someone called me a hypocrite." I looked at him and asked what he had done. He shrugged. "Nothing. I just kept walking. I think I've been called worse." But I saw in his eyes that it hurt. The shame, the fear of judgment, the weight of society. Even far from the church, he still carried the altar within him, and perhaps the true exorcism would be to remove the altar and leave only the man. In the following days, he became quieter. He seemed to withdraw into himself as if trying to understand if he deserved his own happiness. I respected his silence, but one night, while we were on the balcony, he broke the ice. "You know what's hardest?" he said, looking at the horizon. "It's not the sin, it's forgiveness. Not yours, mine." That hit me hard, because I knew what he meant. When guilt becomes part of who you are, forgiveness feels like betrayal. He thought forgiving himself was the same as forgetting what he did, and to him that seemed unforgivable. I came closer and said, "Maybe forgiveness is precisely that, remembering without pain." He looked at me and smiled slightly. "And what if I can't?" I replied. "Then let me try for you." That simple, brief conversation marked a turning point. It was when he began to allow himself more freedom. He started to laugh, to cook, to listen to music. I discovered that he loved old songs, the kind that talk about love without being ashamed of seeming corny. Sometimes he would put on a record and ask me to dance, a little awkwardly, laughing, saying he was rusty, and somehow that laughter made time stand still. But the outside world still existed, and the world always finds a way to test our peace. One morning, he received a call. It was from someone from his old congregation. I could tell by the tone. His face changed, his body stiffened. After a few minutes of conversation, he hung up and remained silent. "Do you want to talk about it?" I asked. He took a deep breath and said, "They're going to call me back. They want me to preach." I felt a knot in my stomach. I didn't know if that was good or bad. He continued, "They said the church needs me, that everyone is willing to forget the past." Asked, "And what did you answer?" He smiled humorlessly and said, "I said I don't know what to preach anymore." That sentence broke me inside, because it was true. After everything he'd been through, he couldn't stand on a pedestal and repeat the same speech anymore. He had changed, and change for many is heresy. In the days that followed, he was torn. Part of him missed the pulpit, the audience, the feeling of being heard. The other part knew that returning would be the same as betraying himself. I didn't interfere. I just said, "The world forgives lies more easily than it accepts truths." He remained silent, but I saw the weight of the choice in his eyes. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, as if talking to someone invisible. I approached and sat beside him. He said, "I've spent my life trying to be God's voice, and now I realize that he has always spoken through silence." That confession was the moment when everything became clear to me. He was no longer the pastor. He was a man stripped of his function, his mask, the role the church had given him, and for the first time, he was whole. In the following days, he declined the invitation. He said he couldn't pretend anymore, that if he were to preach again, it would be about love, not guilt. The phone rang several more times, but he didn't answer anymore. The peace he found in my home was worth more than the applause he missed at the altar. And that night, before going to Sleep, he told me. You know what's funny? When I kicked you out, I thought I was saving you. Now I realize it was you who saved me. I looked at him and replied, we only saved each other because we stopped running away. We lay there, the sounds of our breathing mingling, the past slowly fading away. And for the first time I understood that love doesn't need a blessing to be sacred. If you're listening to this part and understand the weight of breaking free from what you've been taught to fear, comment below, I stopped running away, because what happened after that choice showed that the true miracle didn't come from faith, it came from love. The following days seemed to blend into a sequence of calm scenes, but filled with something I still couldn't name. Time took on a different rhythm, slower, more human, almost as if life had decided to give us a break after everything. He would wake up early, open the windows, let the sun in, and I would watch him from afar, trying to understand if it was real. It was strange to think that the same man who once made me ashamed to exist now walked through my house as if he had always belonged there. As the weeks went by, we found a kind of routine. He cooked lunch, I made coffee. Sometimes we laughed at silly things. Sometimes we spent long minutes in silence just listening to the sound of the rain hitting the roof. It was a kind of peaceful coexistence, but full of small, invisible tensions. The kind that arise when people try to rebuild themselves after a lifetime of hiding. I felt the weight of every gesture, every look. It was as if each touch was a silent prayer, a wordless confession. One night, while we were having dinner, he spoke about loneliness. He said that after leaving the church, he never managed to fit in anywhere again. People saw me as the pastor who fell, he said, his gaze lost on his plate. And I saw myself that way for a long time, as someone who had failed. I looked at him, not knowing what to say. His voice was calm, but there was a tremor that betrayed how much it still hurt. You know what hurts the most? He continued. It's realizing that I never fell. I just stopped lying. Those words kept echoing within me, because in a way they were mine too. I too had lived for years believing that being who I was a mistake, that loving a man distanced me from God. And there, sitting at the table with him, I realized how much guilt silently destroys. It corrodes little by little, until you get used to carrying the weight and call it normal. Over time, he began to open up more. He spoke of the past, of travels, of religious services, of the faithful who sought him out for comfort. He recounted stories in detail, and I saw in his eyes a mixture of nostalgia and regret. Sometimes in the middle of a memory he would stop and say, "How could I have been so blind?" And I would reply, "You only believed what you were taught." He would smile sadly and say, "But now I want to learn everything again from scratch." And that's what we did, and we started from scratch, little by little, without rushing, without labels. He started sleeping in my room. At first it was natural, a cold night, a shared blanket, two tired bodies that just wanted to rest. But the rest became a habit, and the habit became a necessity. There were no promises, just presence. And for two men who had spent their lives running away, being present was enough. One morning, I woke up and realized he wasn't beside me. I went to the living room and found him sitting in the dark, looking at the crucifix he had given me. The moonlight streamed through the window and illuminated his face. There were tears. "I'm still afraid," he said. I approached slowly and asked, "Afraid of what?" He replied, "That all this is a punishment." I sat beside him and, without thinking much, said, "The punishment was before. This is freedom." He was silent for a while and then rested his head on my shoulder. We stayed like that, quiet, while the clock ticked away the unhurried time. I realized that even though he said he was no longer the pastor, part of him still struggled with the past. Fear doesn't disappear all at once. It dissolves slowly, like salt in water. In the following days I began to notice that something had changed in him. He laughed more, spoke more lightly. Even his body seemed more relaxed. But sometimes the old habit returned, the tense gaze, the weight in his words, the silence before bed. It was as if guilt visited him from time to time to remind him that freedom has a price. I didn't demand it. I just waited, because I knew that certain wounds don't heal with words, but with time. One Sunday, he woke me up to the smell of coffee and fresh bread. "Today is Sunday," he said, smiling, "and Sunday is still my favorite day." I joked, "The Lord's Day." He laughed. "No, the day to start over." We sat down to have coffee on the porch, and he, looking at the sky, said, "You know, I used to think faith was about obedience. Now I think faith is about resistance." I didn't answer. I just watched his face illuminated by the morning light. That man who once hid behind a pulpit now seemed to finally exist as who he is, without fear, without masks. And that made me think about how many men live their whole lives like that, hidden inside themselves, slowly dying to please others. How many, like him, still believe that loving is a mistake? Late in the afternoon, he approached and said something that caught me off guard. "Do you think we still have time to be happy?" The question came as a whisper, laden with vulnerability. I looked at him and replied, "Happiness doesn't come with age. It comes when we stop running away." He smiled, and in that smile there was a mixture of relief and fear. "Then maybe it's now." It was at that moment that I realized that the love blossoming between us wasn't a youthful love. It was a love of reconstruction, a love from those who had been broken many times and yet had decided to try again. It was calm yet intense, silent yet full of meaning. It was, in short, true. That night was different. He held my hand, and for the first time, didn't look away. It was as if he was saying, without words, "I am here, whole." And I understood that love is not the opposite of faith. Love is faith in the form of touch. As he fell asleep, I watched his face, the wrinkles, the marks of time, the scars on his soul, and I thought about how ironic life is. The man who taught me to be afraid was now the same one who taught me to be brave. But I knew the world out there hadn't changed yet. There were still judgments, stares, harsh words, and at some point, it would all come knocking at our door. I just didn't imagine how much that reunion with the past would shake up everything we had built together. Before that happened, he told me something that still echoes in my mind today. I think loving a man was my way of truly getting to know God. And if you're listening to me now and understand the weight of this phrase, if you've ever loved someone you were taught to fear, write it in the comments. Love saved me. Because what happened after that peace was the beginning of a new trial, one that would test everything we believed about faith, love, and forgiveness. The world out there never stays quiet for long. Even when we find a little peace, it seems to take pleasure in testing whether what we feel is strong enough to endure. That's more or less how everything started to change again. The routine we had calmly built began to be invaded by glances, whispers, and memories of a past he believed he had left behind. It all began one morning when I found an envelope on my doorstep. Inside was a letter. No return address, just familiar, firm, cold handwriting. "What is wrong never ceases to be wrong. Repent before it's too late." He recognized the handwriting before I did. It was from a former member of the church council, someone who had once called him brother and now treated him like a traitor. I saw his face change. The quiet man who had been rebuilding himself became once again the pastor, haunted by the voices of the past. He folded the letter and put it in his pocket, saying nothing. But I knew that letter had affected him more deeply than he wanted to admit. In the following days he was different. He slept little, spoke less. Sometimes he would wake up in the middle of the night and go to the balcony, as if expecting the dawn to bring answers. I watched him in silence, knowing that there were certain battles that no one can fight for another. But it was painful to see him lost again, trapped between the faith that shaped him and the love that finally set him free. One afternoon he told me something that sounded like both a confession and a warning. I thought forgiveness erased the past, but it only made me remember it in a different way. I replied, "Forgiveness doesn't erase. It only changes the weight." He nodded, but I saw the fear in his eyes. The fear of being judged again, the fear of losing what he had just found. Days later, what I feared happened. A video began circulating on social media, an old excerpt from one of his sermons, where he stated with conviction, "Men who lie with other men will bring the fire of hell upon themselves." Someone had resurrected the past to hurt him, and the video quickly spread. I saw his name in comments, jokes, insults. I saw people writing that he was paying for what he preached. When I showed him the video, he stood there staring silently at the screen. Then he closed his laptop and simply said, "Maybe I deserve it." That cut me. Deserve what? The cruelty. He didn't answer. "You're paying for something that's no longer you." He sighed. "But people don't know that, and maybe they never will." The silence between us grew thick, almost palpable. I wanted to find the right words, but there was no defense against the past. So I just held his hand and said, "What matters is who you are now." He looked at me, his eyes welling up with tears, and replied, "But what if the world never accepts it?" That question stayed stuck inside me, because deep down, it was the same one I'd been asking myself for years, and for the first time I realized that the only difference between us was the time it took each of us to discover that love doesn't need anyone's permission to exist. That night, he disappeared. I woke up and the room was empty. I found only a note on the table. I need to understand if I can still be who I am without hurting you. Those were the longest hours of my life. I walked around the house, sat down, stood up, looked out the window. It was as if the past had come to claim him again. 2 days passed before he returned. When he entered through the door, his face was weary, his eyes tired, but there was a different kind of serenity there. He said, "I've returned to the temple." I froze. "Why?" He replied, "Because I needed to face it head-on, not to justify myself but to say goodbye." He recounted that he entered and found some familiar faces, others who pretended not to see him. He said he walked to the altar and remained silent for a while, and then, for the first time, he truly prayed. I didn't ask for forgiveness, nor did I ask for a blessing. I only gave thanks for still being alive. As he spoke, I watched him and realized there was something new about him. That man who had once lived divided now seemed whole, even with the scars. "I realized I'm no longer a pastor," he said. "I'm just a man who has learned to love." And it was there, in that simplicity, that something inside me also healed. Because I understood that love, when it's true, doesn't need to conquer anyone. It only needs to endure. From then on, we began to live with less fear. He started writing again, not sermons but letters. Letters to no one, or perhaps to God. Sometimes he would leave them on the table, and I would read them silently. In them he spoke about forgiveness, about time, about courage. One struck me deeply. It said, "Loving another man is my most sincere act of faith." But the world, once again, wasn't going to let it go easily. One day a report came out in a local newspaper. Former pastor seen with man in city cafe. The text was short, but cruel. The headline became a joke in religious groups. Shame, blasphemy, false prophet. The messages arrived on his cell. Phone like small stabs. I saw him hold the device, take a deep breath and say, "They're not wrong to judge me, they're too blind to see." That broke me, but he didn't cry. He didn't explain himself. He just hung up the phone and said, "This time, I'm not running away." And he didn't run away. That night we went for a walk. People stared, whispered, but he kept walking with his head held high, his hand firmly holding mine. And it was in that simple, silent, and courageous gesture that I understood what true faith was. Faith isn't about believing everything will turn out all right. Faith is about persevering even when the world insists on telling you that you shouldn't exist. That walk was the most beautiful sermon I've ever heard. Preached without a microphone, without an altar, without a Bible, just two mature men marked by pain, walking as if they had finally made peace with life. He looked at me and said, "Today, if anyone asks me where God is, I'll answer, here." And he pointed to his chest. Inside what I feel, inside who I am. That phrase stuck with me, because for the first time I saw that his courage didn't come from religion, it came from love. And that's what sustained us, even when the world was falling apart outside. If you're listening to me now and have ever felt the burden of needing to prove that your love is worthy, comment below. I'm not going to run away either. Because what came after that courage was the most beautiful, and also the hardest, part of our story. After that night, after that walk hand in hand down the street where everyone could see, something changed. Not just between us, but inside each of us. It was as if the fear had lost some of its power, as if the weight of years of silence was finally beginning to dissolve. He seemed calmer, more whole, but there was still something in his gaze, a kind of vigilance, a constant care, like someone who knows that any carelessness could cost them the peace they've just won. I understood that fear, because it was the same fear I carried inside. The fear of being seen, the fear of being judged, the fear of loving in a world that still believes love needs a form to be accepted. In the following days, the routine returned, but it wasn't the same anymore. He would wake up before me, open the windows and let the fresh air in. Sometimes I would make coffee and leave a cup beside me with a short note, "The day will be light," or "Thank you for staying." Other times he would just watch me sleep, with that serene look of someone who had found something they didn't even know they were looking for. It was beautiful, but it also hurt, because there was a kind of hidden sadness in every gesture of his, as if he knew that this peace might be temporary. One morning while I was washing the dishes, he asked, "Do you think love changes the way people look at us?" I was silent, thinking. Then I replied, "Love doesn't change how others see us. It changes the way we see ourselves." He was quiet for a while, drying a plate, and then said, "Then maybe I'm starting to see myself for the first time." That was one of the lightest days. We went for a walk, went to the market, bought fruit, laughed at little things. He greeted people with a sincere smile, hiding nothing, and I realized that the man who once preached about shame now carried pride. Not the pride of someone who defies, but the pride of someone who accepts their own heart. But peace, as always, is short-lived. In the afternoon, when we returned, he received another letter, this time without direct insults, but worse. It was a letter of forgiveness from his old church. They said he would always be a son of the flock, that they loved him, but that they were praying that God would free him from the temptations that still held him captive. He read the entire letter without saying anything. Then he tore it to pieces and threw it in the trash. "They didn't understand anything," he murmured. I asked, "And do you still miss them?" He replied, "Not them. I miss believing." Those words stayed with me all day, because I knew what that was like, missing something that, deep down, also hurt you. Faith, when used to oppress, leaves a strange longing, the longing for a time when believing seemed easier. That night, he was sitting on the porch, looking at the sky. I approached and asked what he was thinking about. He said, "I'm wondering if God still hears me." I replied, "Maybe he's listening right now through the silence." He turned to me and smiled. "You talk like a pastor," I laughed, "and now you talk like a man in love." That night, he kissed me for the first time without fear, without hesitation, without guilt. It was a simple kiss, but full of truth. A kiss from someone who no longer asked for apologies. His hand trembled, but not from shame. It was from emotion. And there, in the middle of the room, I realized that what we had been told our whole lives was a sin, was in fact the purest form of gratitude I had ever felt. In the days that followed, he began writing again. But this time, not for the church, nor for God. He wrote for me. He left notes scattered around the house, little phrases that seemed like prayers of love. "You are my daily miracle. Peace has your scent. There is no sky more beautiful than the one where I see you wake up." Each note was a reminder that love, when it's true, doesn't need an audience, only the courage to be lived. One night, he called me over to the table and showed me what he was writing. It was a letter, long, dense, full of confessions. "I want to read this aloud," he said, his voice trembling. I nodded. He began, "For years, I said that love between two men was an affront to God. Today I understand that the affront was using his name to deny what he himself planted in me. I preached against what I needed most. And when I finally found this love, I didn't find punishment. I found forgiveness." His voice faltered, but he continued, "If this letter ever reaches the hands of those who still believe that love needs to have a gender to be divine, I hope they understand. The sin was never in loving. The sin was in being afraid." I remained silent, feeling his words slowly sink in, as if filling a space within me that had always been empty. He finished reading and asked, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. "If I ever leave before you, I want you to read this aloud, even if no one understands, even if no one applauds," I replied. "I promise." That night we slept embraced. The world outside seemed distant, small. There was only his breathing and the calm sound of the wind. But fate, as always, was lurking. The next day he received another visit, a man in a suit and tie with a stern look, a former colleague from ministry. He came on behalf of the council. He said there was concern, that many were praying for him, and that they wanted to help him find his way back. I listened to everything in silence behind the door. The words were old, cold, rehearsed, the same ones he once used against me. "You're straying," the man said, "but there's still time." He calmly replied, "Time for what?" The visitor hesitated, then said, "To free yourself from this deception." There was a long silence, and then, with a serenity I had never seen before, he replied, "The only mistake was spending my life trying to erase what God wrote in me." The man didn't answer. He stood up, straightened his jacket and said, "The church will continue praying for you," and he left. When I closed the door, I saw his eyes were watery, but his expression was serene. "Are you all right?" I asked. He smiled. For the first time I am. That answer stuck with me, because it was true. He no longer needed anyone's approval. He didn't need an altar, a pulpit, or a blessing. He had found what he was looking for, inner peace. And if you're listening to this now, maybe you understand what he felt. Maybe you, too, have spent your whole life asking God to fix you, when in reality, he only wanted you to accept yourself. If that's your case, comment below. I accepted myself, because what happened after that visit was the moment when love ceased to be a secret and became truth. That week, the atmosphere between us felt like one of those silent intervals between calm and a storm. He was different. There was serenity, yes, but also a melancholy hidden behind every gesture. I saw him more thoughtful, writing more than he spoke, staring into nothingness with the gaze of someone listening to a voice coming from within, perhaps the voice of guilt, perhaps the voice of peace, perhaps both mixed together. His letters began to change in tone. They were no longer just love notes or outpourings, but profound reflections, almost prayers. Sometimes he would write loose phrases on scraps of paper and leave them around the house, as if he wanted to spread a new gospel, a gospel without sin, without punishment, without fear. One day I found a note on the windowsill. God has not abandoned me. I was the one who hid from him. Another, left on the breakfast table, said, "The love I denied was the same love he used to find me." It both thrilled and frightened me at the same time. It was as if he were preparing for something, for a new beginning, or perhaps for a farewell. I didn't know. I only felt a silent movement happening inside him, something I couldn't control. One night, I woke to the sound of the piano. He was in the living room playing a soft old melody, the kind that seems to speak to the heart. I stood in the doorway, watching. He played with his eyes closed, and tears streamed down his face. When he finished, he was silent for a few seconds and said without looking at me, "Did you know that there are prayers that aren't said aloud because the heart is afraid to hear the answer?" I approached and asked, "And what was your prayer?" He took a deep breath and replied, "May God forgive me if the love I have found is the same love he has given me." I sat down next to him. We stayed there without saying anything, just listening to the echo of the keys. Time seemed suspended. I realized that behind the peace he conveyed, there was still a battle. That of someone trying to reconcile faith and love after a lifetime, believing that one cancels out the other. In the following days, he began to go out more. He said he needed to walk, see the world, relearn the colors, as he put it. Sometimes he would come back with flowers, other times with stories. One day he returned with an old book in his hands. "I bought it from a vendor in the square," he said. It was an old Bible with notes in the margins. In one of them, someone had written, "Faith is a mirror. Whoever sees love has already understood what God is." He showed it to me and said, "This is the only passage I still believe in." That phrase kept swirling inside me for the rest of the day. Faith as a mirror. To love a man and see God in that love. That was powerful, almost forbidden, but at the same time it was the truest thing I had ever heard. One late afternoon he approached me with a calm but serious look. "I thought about going back there," he said, "to the church." My whole body froze. "Why?" I asked. He took a deep breath. "To close the cycle. To show that no door can close forever when love is what enters." I tried to convince him not to go. "You don't need that. You're already free." He replied, "Freedom that doesn't confront the past is just escape." And he left. I didn't want to go with him. I stayed waiting, counting the hours, imagining what was happening inside. When he returned, his face was serene, but his eyes were red. "How was it?" I asked. He said, "Silence. Only silence. And sometimes, silence is the greatest forgiveness there is." After that, he changed. He began to live as if he had made peace with everything. He no longer talked about the church, nor about guilt. He talked about plans, about traveling, about cooking together, about growing old in peace. And for the first time I believed that he had truly freed himself. But fate is treacherous. Sometimes when we find peace, it comes to collect its price. One day he started coughing, first mildly, then constantly. I thought it was the cold, his age. He insisted he was fine. "It's just my body reminding me that I'm still alive," he'd say humorously. But I realized something wasn't right. He lost weight, slept poorly, and the nights became far too long. One morning he woke up sweating and breathless. I held his hand, worried. "I need to take you to the hospital," I said. He shook his head. "No, I don't want any more hospitals or sermons or cold rooms. I just want the present moment," I insisted. but he only smiled. "Do you remember what I said about faith?" he asked. "That it's a mirror?" I replied. "It is. And now, when I look at you, I see God." The following weeks were a mixture of worry and fear. I did everything to hide my anguish, but he noticed. "Don't be like that," he would say. "Life isn't taking anything away from me. It's just teaching me to be grateful before I go." He kept writing, even though he was weak. The letters became a ritual. Sometimes I would see him lying down, writing with trembling handwriting. "They're for you," he would say, "but only open them when I'm no longer here." I couldn't bear to hear that. We pretended it was a joke, but there was truth in every word. One afternoon, while I was helping him to bed, he held my hand and said, "You know, if someone ever asks you if I regret it, say yes. I regret not having loved you sooner." I couldn't answer. Tears streamed down my face without asking permission. He stroked my face and said, "Crying is praying with your eyes, and I want to see you pray for me." That night, he slept more peacefully than on previous days. The sun rose and the house was silent. The same silence that had previously frightened me now felt like a refuge, and if you've listened this far, perhaps you understand what it means to love someone who has transformed you, someone who came to heal a pain that love itself caused. If you've experienced something like this, comment below. I too loved without regret, because what happened after that early morning was the point at which love and faith ceased to be two different paths and became one. The following morning seemed motionless, as if time had forgotten to pass. I opened my eyes and for a moment didn't recognize the silence. It was heavy, dense, unlike the peaceful silence that usually filled the house. The sun streamed through the curtain in streaks of golden light, but the bed beside me was empty. The pillow still held the shape of his head, the sheet the warmth of his body, but the space was lifeless. I got up slowly, feeling the cold floor beneath my feet, and called his name once, then again, and again. No answer. I found him sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, his gaze lost on the horizon. The coffee was getting cold in his cup, and his hands trembled slightly. I approached silently and sat beside him. He turned his face and smiled with that tired half-smile I knew so well. "I thought you were still sleeping," he said. I replied, "I thought you'd never wake up." He laughed, a short but sincere laugh. "Not yet, not yet." For a moment, the fear dissipated. We stood there, the two of us, watching the sunrise. He seemed calm, as if he had made peace with the world. But there was something different, a profound serenity, the kind you only see in those who have understood that love is the last miracle life offers before the final silence. In the following days, he grew weaker. He spoke little, slept much. The house seemed to breathe with him. When he slept, the air felt light. When he coughed, everything trembled. I did what I could. I cared for him, gave him medicine, read to him. Sometimes I read the letters he had written himself. He liked to hear his own voice in my words. "It sounds better when you say it," he would say, and smile. One night, I woke up with the feeling that something was different. The moonlight streamed through the window, and the room was too quiet. I turned and saw that he was awake, watching me. "What's wrong?" I asked. He replied, "Nothing. I just wanted to remember the face that taught me what forgiveness is." I tried to hide the lump in my throat and joked, "Then remember it." "Well, because you won't find another like it." He laughed, and for a few seconds the world seemed whole again. But the truth is, I already knew. We always know. When the body begins to say goodbye, the soul changes its rhythm. He started to become quieter than usual, as if he were listening to something I couldn't hear. Sometimes I would look at the sky and say, "You know what's beautiful? It's realizing that even the end can have light." One morning he asked to go out. "I want to see the church one more time," he said. I hesitated but ended up taking him. The road was the same as always, the cracked asphalt, the old trees, the bell that still rang every hour. When we arrived, he stood before the door, looking at the building as one confronts an old enemy, who was also in some way a friend. We went in together. The smell of wood, the echo of footsteps, the altar, everything the same, yet everything different. He walked to the pulpit and ran his hand over the polished wood. "Here, I used to preach against love," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Today I only want to thank you for having found it." I stood beside him in silence. Then he closed his eyes and without warning began to pray, not as a pastor, but as a man. The words came out low, slow, but full of life. If there is a God who listens to me, may he understand. I have sinned, yes, but I sinned by loving too late. That phrase struck me deeply. It was confession and poetry at the same time. I realized that moment wasn't about redemption. It was about freedom. He wasn't asking for forgiveness anymore. He was only asking to be remembered with love.